The Demise of an Irish Clan. Chapter 7. Conversion and Coercion. In the mid-1750s, the poor majority in Ireland lived in utmost poverty. Their accommodation was squalid, and their diets made up of potato, turnips, and a little wheat, milk, and on rare occasions beef. The population was increasing at an enormous rate. It was only the narrow coastal plain which provided a market economy, where they managed to sell some of its produce. The poorer folk, living further inland up in the hills, depended on a subsistence economy. High rents were increasingly being left unpaid, which generated debts, the result of which meant evictions. The property owners forced the poor to pay an ever-increasing amount for rent. The interest rates on owed money continued to rise. The whole system discouraged improvements in property and proper farm management, particularly towards land drainage and any sort of savings, as a cushion for poor harvests. It was a self-generating national disaster, which seemed to be unstoppable, and as it turned out, was. About this time Dianiel O'Cary adopted the Protestant religion, and wishing to anglicize his name still further, in order to make a distinction between the families, asked for a meeting with the then head of the family, to declare an oath whereby he would reassume the spelling of Cary with a K, removing the prefix O and the use of C. Many of the Irish began to look beyond their local areas for employment, and the more adventurous found that America and the Caribbean offered them more. America became an important land for the Irish immigrant labour. The life appealed to many for its religious nonconformity and political independence. The American War of Independence started in 1775 and was an inspiration to many of the Irish poor to get back at the English. O'Halloran, an Irish historian, writing in 1778, gave O'Meara as a Lord Chief of an ancient house descended from the O'Briens. Many of the O'Cary clan joined in his service with the Irish Brigade. A number of the clan then started to use the anglicised form of O'Cary more often at the turn of the 18th century. Margaret Cary's second son, Thomas Padrick, married Julia, daughter of Roderick Murphy of Castle Dermot in Kildare, who had 4 sons, the eldest being named Thomas, as was the custom. He was the first of this family to stop using the prefix O and to begin using the name of Cary spelt with a K. He married Mary, daughter of John Keogh of Castle Pollard, an agricultural town in Westmeath, in 1815, that died in Dublin in 1836, interred in the churchyard of Artane. In the late 1770s there was a widespread agricultural crisis. This was not the first time that this happened. With the national food crop that occurred, poor harvest, low cattle prices, high cost of wheat, potatoes and milk, and all this had been felt before. The massive problem for Ireland was that the population relied upon a staple diet of potatoes, and where the English relied upon bread as the staple diet, the Irish relied upon potatoes. Corn was relatively simple to import and had a better shelf life. Potatoes, however, needed careful handling from a suitable source, and weight for weight was wasteful. It was also a difficult commodity to ship. The enclosure movement caused further resentment. Rents increased yet again, and there was a decline in wages. Inflation was rife. A number of militant movements raised popular passions to influence the landowners and government to reduce rents, all to no avail. Taxation, tithes, rents and church dues were a continual grievance. Commercial cotton weaving and spinning was introduced into Ireland in 1777. 3 years later, modern machines and expertise were brought over from England and established an enterprise which gave employment to many unemployed people in towns and villages. This was the start to the great Irish linen industry. The latest steam engines were imported from England to provide power for many of the mills. No longer did the manufacturers have to rely upon water to drive their wheels. These engines required coal and allied services that in themselves created new business ventures which prospered, initiating further capital expenditure. Heavy industries like mining, iron and steel producers, pottery manufacturers and tanning, glassware and coach building all needed raw materials delivered by road, canal, river and ports. These large building projects needed capital investment. Investors saw the opportunity to make a profit. They could see the outcome of an abundance of cheap labour and the profitability created by these first cotton mills. This was the time rural populations in villages and towns showed a remarkable turn inwards, toward uniting, engaging in shared interests. These rural folk were in the main Catholics and spoke Gaelic, and they were keenly aware that the city workers were a set apart from their life in the village. Sporting events, fairs, markets, wakes, funerals, cockfights, hunting and field events abounded, and these gatherings united people and stimulated political thought. Gradually the unrest grew until eventually nightly political meetings were arranged. In Tipperary, Neath and Limerick, under the pretext of hurling and playing football, crowds gathered, bands played, shouts were heard and fights broke out, and these events confirmed Catholic strength and highlighted resident disaffection. Protestants feared the worst and barricaded their houses on fair days and remained indoors. United Irishmen and Orangemen took to using these outings to start airing grievances, which always led to fights. Thomas, son of Christopher Carey and a brother of William, Matthew and James, owned a newspaper in Dublin. He was sympathetic to the cause of United Free Ireland, printing stories about absentee landlords and the terrible conditions rural folk were living in. These articles produced attacks from the establishment, who accused him of printing seditious stories. Thomas was tried at the King's Bench and acquitted. The ruling body continued to hound him and force his printing business to close down. The whole family were involved in the printing trade as either reporters or tradesmen. Matthew Carey, 1785 to 1824, became internationally known as a publisher. Born in Dublin in 1760, he was indentured to serve his apprenticeship as a letterpress printer and to make up the sticks of type to be clamped into the form. Later, befriended by Benjamin Franklin, he emigrated to America, where he married Miss Faverham, devoting all his energies to the publication of the Dewey version of the Bible, founding the first American Sunday School Society and becoming one of America's greatest publishers. Dublin, by the turn of the century, was the second biggest city in the British Isles. It was the most industrious and wealthy area of Ireland, as were those closest to the English mainland, and in the middle of the coastline was Dublin, the seat of power, the legal centre and administrative capital. Its population contained the greatest number of professionals, guildsmen, artisans, journeymen and apprentices, and this power gave a reason why Dublin was the centre of such unrest and revolution. The final straw was the drought of 1781. Later, a marvellous engineering scheme was put into place, the construction of a great canal and series of locks to join Dublin to the River Shannon. This magnificent feat opened up the interior and controlled water distribution to the central plains, eliminating the fear of future droughts. Ireland was now an independent country but sharing a common monarch. In reality, many ties were there to check true self-government, which was never workable. In 1790, the Act of Union saw London replace Dublin as the centre of political power for the Irish, and by 1797 the United Irishmen were a powerful force in Leinster, and plans were made to have a general uprising. Oaths were taken to ensure a committed gathering, which included tradespeople, shopkeepers, and many of the middle class. The Orange Order objected, and mass atrocities were perpetuated. In the 1800s, Kilkerry parish was reported by Ireland's Ordnance Survey as lying to the north of County Tipperary between Neenah, Cloughlormond and Templemore, and bounded to the east by Clonist in Kings. St. Cary's Church lay near the centre of the barony of Upper Ormond, situated 1.5 miles southeast of Toomevara. The barony contained 14 parishes. It was described as a small parish chiefly under cultivation, with the nearby village of Toomevara declaring 790 inhabitants, its nearest large settlement. Fairs were held on Whit Monday, July the 27th, September the 29th and November the 4th for cattle, corn and butter. In 1818, although there were a number of the family who used the Carey spelling, this was the first time that EY was used in Ireland, and it is to Patrick and Mary ní Lonergan we find recorded, initiating the event. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. They removed the E 5 years later. With the passing of a few more years, Carey, with or without the E, Carew and Carey, seems to be an almost interchangeable choice by family members recorded in the Powerstone RC register. By the 1850s, Griffith's primary valuation gives 68 Careys in all of Ireland. These use the spelling with a K and an EY. Powerstone lies in the civil parish of Kilgrant, in the barony of Iffa and Offa East, between Clonmel and the village of Kilshillan. As in North Tipperary, Offaly and Westmeath, these spellings become common variants of O'Cary. It's difficult from this distance to comprehend the importance the spelling makes to the use of one's name. However, records prove that it does, prompted no doubt by strong reasons at the time. And even today some members feel free to use the Gaelic form, whilst others use the anglicised version. The amount of farmland in Ireland was now unable to feed the expanding population, and this fact occurred in almost all regions, not just in the rich, more industrial sectors with the greatest labour force. The problems stemmed from the way land was controlled by rents and tithes. Tenure was restricted so that the farmers budgeted and planned for short-term gain. This didn't bode well for economic rotation of crops. The construction of land drainage ditches, the removal of stone from the fields, or the latest views on animal husbandry. The use of better soil management to increase fertility was also much talked about. The landowners, the landlords and the absentee property agents skimmed the cream off the milk. The profits of the country's wealth, most of the money found its way towards the rich English boroughs and aristocracy. It was a case of negligence, ignorance, and lack of care on the part of local and national governments in both England and Ireland. The potato blight finished off what poor economics had started. It's believed by many that in the middle of the 19th century people lived close to where they were born and never left the village. Records disprove that view. And even without those facts, reality dictates that that would be impossible. This was the age of large families. A large percentage of young people not long out of school would have to travel far to find and be trained for work. Local recourses could not sustain such large numbers, and houses were in short supply. And by 1851 over 50% of the population was living more than a couple of miles from their birthplace. The advent of the bicycle made travelling to work easier, and the coming of the railways added to the distance travelled. It was the growth of towns and cities which drew the migrant workforce, and it wasn't just the need to earn money or to find housing. It was exciting for the young, and the job options more varied. There are a small number of Gaelic Irish, mainly in Cork, Galway and Dublin, who still use the old family name of O'Cary. However, those who use Kerry, recorded today by the place name Kilkerry rather than Kerry with a C, are based in southwest Ireland and Dublin. And when the Normans, parliamentarians and Anglo-Irish forced the Gaelic Irish off their ancient clan lands, it was to mainly western areas they went: Galway, Kerry and Cork. It would seem that it was mainly immigrants to America, England and its empire at the turn of the 18th century who used Kerry with a K and the EY. This more anglicised form. Those worldwide who use the Kerry form are, however, more numerous. Dublin was a setting-off point for the immigrants, mostly to land at Liverpool, and from there was a regular coach service to London and other chief cities where there was work to be found. If London-bound, then it was to Westminster, and as likely as not, the Rookeries, where cheap lodging was to be found, perhaps with relatives. Thomas Carey arrived there in about 1816 with his bag of tools, ready to start a new life.